Thank you very much, John, for the lovely introduction. And I also want to thank Michael for the invitation to present to the Society this evening. But I am so delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about the research that I undertook for my Master's in History of the Family at the University of Limerick. So, as you can see, my research was a study of a Docklands community in North Wall in Dublin in 1911. Now, highlighted here in blue, I selected a rectangular formation of housing, and it consisted of 34 streets on which lived 560 households or 2,575 people in 379 properties. So here, I don't know if you can see my laser pointer, but here you can see Sheriff Street lower, Common Street, Mayor Street lower, and then Guild Street over here on the right. And through the middle of this is Newfoundland Street and Nixa Street. Now down here you have the Liffey, and over here the Custom House. Then here is the cattle dairyage, and that was where cattle were housed until they were shipped across to Britain. And then you have railway lines running all the way down Spencer Dock, and then over here Amiens Street Station. So why North Wall? Well, I've had a growing interest in North Wall as my father was born here. And this is where our ancestors settled after moving to Dublin City from Dún Laoghaire and before that Clontarf. Now, our family is interconnected with so many in North Wall during the late 19th and into the 20th centuries. So when it came to doing the Masters, I knew my research had to be based in North Wall. But I wanted to take a slightly different tack to what was going on at the community level. What was happening in terms of type of family, birth and death. I really wanted to get a handle on the experiences of death in the community. If birth control was something that women were using, and what did families look like? Now, there's one caveat here, and that the study sample is not a random selection. So the findings don't provide national statistical significance, but they provide an understanding of local urban demographics. So tonight I'll be talking briefly about the landscape of North Dock and then North Wall. I'll go through the primary sources I used for the study. I'll talk about the study population, housing, employment and earnings. And then I'll look at the types of household in North Wall and their prevalence. I'll discuss mortality, the experience in North Wall and the factors that influence death. And finally, I'll talk about fertility in North Wall and whether birth control was used or not. Now, tied up in this is the age at marriage, so I'll present my findings on that as well. So first of all, let's put the area into context and take a look at North Dock electoral district, of which North Wall is a part. Now, from the census records, North Dock constituted an area of 565 statute acres. And the valuation of housing and land was the highest in Dublin City at £89,528 compared to Arran Dock, which had a similar acreage at 569 statute acres, but a valuation of £69,539. Now in 1911, North Dock's population was 24,506 people who lived in 3,073 houses out of a stock of 3,354. But the population didn't grow much from 1901, with an increase of only 872 people. And at the time of the census, the population was made up of 12,517 males and 11,989 females. Now, it's quite interesting when you look at how the population grew in North Dock, because most of the growth happened between 1861 and 1881. And this is very much in line with the rebuilding of North Wall Quay. Now, North Wall was the transit hub for goods and livestock to Britain, Europe, and elsewhere, but it was also a point of emigration, particularly to Britain. So then as ships moved from sail to steam and then to deep water vessels, North Wall expanded eastwards, and it started with the relocation of the Custom House from Wellington Quay to Custom House Quay in 1824. Now, with this development, you have the building of commercial properties and, of course, railway connections, and also nearby housing for the workforce of sailors, stokers, and others. Now, between 1864 and 1869, North Wall Quay was rebuilt under the direction of Dr. Bindon Blood Stoney, who was the chief engineer of the Dublin Port and Docks Board. And this was to convert the quay to a deep water berth, which resulted in an increased number of vessels entering Dublin Port. And from the census reports, the population of North Dock rose by 9% from 1861 to 1871, while Dublin City actually decreased by just over 3%. Between 1871 and 1881, the North Dock population grew by 12.1% compared to only 1.3% in Dublin City. So the local population grew when Dublin City's population wasn't. So my first task was to identify the sources of evidence for the study, and my main source was the 1911 census. Now, this involved downloading the transcribed data from Form A on the census website for every household in the study area. And that data then had to be cleaned and in some instances corrected. Now, an example of the cleaning that was necessary is the return you see here, where the children are described as married. And if you see the little ditto marks underneath there, so they were transcribed as married. Now, other instances were where deceased children, were named on the form, but subsequently excluded by the enumerator. Now, I also used the 1901 census returns, Tom's directory, electoral rolls, birth, marriage and death records, burial records, the name book from Dublin Port Archive, the returns and reports of the Registrar General, and the North Dock valuation book from Tailteann Éireann. Now, the census enumerator's returns identified a post office, 4 public houses, shops, greengrocers, spirit grocers, a dairy, a forge, and a labour yard run by St. Vincent de Paul, and also identified were 21 vacant and 3 uninhabited premises. Now, one of my concerns was whether I had caught every street and household in the area. And to cross-check this, I knew I needed a map. And this next task I absolutely loved. I printed off an A0-sized map of my study area from GeoHive. I'd already taken myself into the valuation offices and accessed the North Dock valuation records. So using these records, Tom's directory and the electoral rolls, I started to identify and name the streets and to number the buildings. And all of this information I transcribed to a digital map of the area. And from this, we can see that the main shopping area, if you can see here, was Sheriff Street Lower. See all the pink dots are shops, spirit grocers, licensed premises. And then on Mare Street, we can see the number of stables. You can see here all the blue dots. And then there's a substantial dairy here, the orange dot. Now, a notice of sale in the Freeman's Journal in 1922 stated that this dairy could accommodate 30 heads of cattle. And then given its proximity to shipping and warehouses, it does make sense that there were a lot of stables along this street. But there were also cow sheds to be found behind the dwellings on Gill Street, and piggeries, which are these brown dots, on Williams Place. Now, a great way to look at the population is with a population pyramid. And the population pyramid of the study area shown here follows a relatively young community, but there are some interesting pointers for life expectancy, death and marriage. Now, firstly, you can see that the bottom of the pyramid or the base isn't that broad. If the base was very broad, it would indicate a very young population. Now, the narrowing of the pyramid, get this pointer to work, the narrowing here for the 5 to 9-year-olds on the female side could indicate early death, but this would require validation with the civil registers. Now, you can also see here the declining number of men and women over 55, and this was possibly caused by emigration of 20 to 30-year-olds at the time of the agricultural depression, but it could also be a reflection of life expectancy at the time, which was about 54 years. Or it could just be that older people moved out of the area. Now, if you look at the 20 to 24-year cohort, you can see a decrease here in single people, particularly females. But this decrease really starts to accelerate for the 25 to 29-year-olds, again, particularly for women. So now we'll take a look at housing. Now, not surprisingly, the standard of accommodation in the area was predominantly third class. 169 households lived in second class accommodation, 346 lived in third class accommodation, and 40 lived in fourth class accommodation. Only 5 households lived in first class accommodation. Now, 538 households lived in predominantly 1 and 2 rooms. In 23 Gill Street, 22 people or 4 families lived in single-roomed accommodation. Now, a similar example is 29 Common Street, where 21 people or 5 families lived in single rooms. But by comparison, the largest family of 13 people lived in 6 rooms at 21 Mare Street Lower. Now, I only found one incidence of 2 households comprising 5 people sharing the exact same room. Now, this is an example of the types of cottages to be found throughout Dublin City. And this photo is of Brady's cottages in South Dock, which was taken for the 1913 housing inquiry. And these would be very similar to the types of cottages in North Wall. So I wanted to get an idea of what rent was being charged for accommodation in the area. And for sale notices in the newspapers provided some evidence of what people were paying. Now, these notices are from the Freeman's Journal and the Irish Times in 1909 and show that in some cases rent was not unlike that of the Artisans' Dwelling Company. Now, the rent for Orr's cottages at £1.17 all combined together, that works out at roughly 3 shillings and 1 pence per week per cottage. Now, on the census, 3 Orr's cottages was a third-class dwelling with 1 family of 4 living in 1 room. 1 to 5 Ties cottages were a mix of second and third class dwellings, and rent here at 5 shillings was very similar to that charged by the Artisans' Dwelling Company. Now, according to the Housing Inquiry report, they charged 5 shillings and 3 pence for a cottage of 3 rooms, but the number of rooms in Ties cottages ranged from 1 to 4. So if that was the order of rent being charged, well, what was the workforce in North Wall paid? So let's look at the state of employment and associated earnings. Now, Dublin City, was experiencing economic stagnation with low population growth and steadily falling employment. Now, basically, the city had failed to keep pace with industrialisation, unlike other port cities such as Belfast and Bristol. So as a result, Dublin had shifted to a service economy where a large proportion of the workforce was engaged in transport and labouring. Now, given its industrial profile, North Wall's workforce was primarily engaged in transport and ancillary occupations. In 1911, 1 in 5 males described themselves as general labourers, but in North Wall, 28.5% were general labourers and 6.9% described themselves as coal, grain or key labourers. So labouring accounted for 35.4%. But occupations available in North Wall also included skilled and semi-skilled work, such as foundry workers, shipbuilders, stonemasons and carpenters. Now, earnings for Dublin's working class varied. Wages for unskilled workers were low, with labourers generally earning £1 or 20 shillings per week, while skilled workers were earning 35 shillings. Now, if we look specifically at North Wall, the name book of manual workers provides evidence of daily pay rates. Now, the name book is a register of workers employed by the Dublin Port and Docks Board, and it lists when workers were taken on, what their starting pay was, when their pay was increased by how much, whether they were strikers, if and when they were laid off and the reasons why, and it's a fantastic resource. But the book shows pay rates were in line with the labourers' rates of 20 shillings per week. Now, some labourers were earning less than that, but this was changed to a standard 20 shillings in 1912. And then dockers' pay rose to 30 shillings per week by 1915. So you can see here the daily pay rates offered to workers as listed in the name book. And you can see that skilled workers were earning roughly double that of unskilled workers, except for the poor office cleaner, who's only getting 1 shilling and 3 pence per day. And this is an example now from the name book. And you can see the names of those employed, and I'll actually bring in a zoomed in version. You can see the names of those employed, when they entered service, what age they were when they were first employed, and what their occupation was. And you can see what their starting pay is. So here, this person is earning 4 shillings and 6 pence a day. Now, you can also track their working life with the comments in the relevant years, stating transfers, pay rises, whether they were sick, laid off, taken on. And you can see here in red the word striker relating to the 1913 lockout. And then under here it would be when they were taken back on again. So the first question to be answered in my study was what household structures or family types were predominant in North Wall? And the answers to this question tell us a lot about family decision making. Did families include grandparents, or was it just the husband and wife and their children? Did working children stay with widows' mothers and support them? Did they stay with widowed fathers? So this information gives us a real feel for what the community looked like, but also how it could evolve as time went on. So just to give you a bit of background, in the 1960s, a very influential historian, Peter Laslett, co-founded the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, known as CAMPOP. And he studied populations in pre- and post-industrial England and Wales. Now, from his research, he developed definitions of household structure, and these are still used in demographic analysis today. And the benefit of these categories is that they enable comparisons with other studies, such as studies of Belfast by CAMPOP, and Irish studies by Carmel Corrigan, Yoshifumi Shimizu, Cormac O'Grada, and others. Now, there are 5 categories of households with subgroups within, from solitary households, parents with children, widows and widowers with children, extended households, and those with no relationships whatsoever, and everything in between, excuse me. So I had to inspect every household in my study area and assign them to one of Laslett's categories. Now, from the table on the left, you can see that simple families dominate at 72.2%. Now, that's basically the nuclear family of parents and children, although there are some widows and widowers with children and couples on their own there as well. Now, non-marital households accounted for 5.7% of the households in North Wall, and this was significantly lower than a study by the aforementioned Carmel Corrigan of urban households. And she found 12.6% were non-marital. And Yoshifumi Shimizu's study of Dublin City found non-maritals accounted for 10.3%. Next, I looked at the age of household heads, and I found that the age distribution followed that of Dublin City. The largest concentration of household heads was in the 30 to 39 age cohort, followed by the 40 to 49 age cohort. And the average age of household heads was 44.9 years. So looking now at the size of households, analysis showed that the average household size was 4.4 persons, and this is slightly lower than Shimizu's findings for Dublin City of 4.6. Now, households of 4 persons were the most common, followed by 3, 2, 6, and 5-person households. Now, children are defined as sons and daughters of the household head, regardless of their age. And my study showed that the average number of children in each household is 3.2, slightly higher than Shimizu's data of 3 for County Dublin and 3.1 for Dublin City. But the most common number of children in a household is 2, 27% of North Wall households, followed by households of 4, 1, and 3 children. And while Shimizu found 1-child households accounted for 24% in Dublin City, in North Wall, they accounted for only 17% of households. The average age for boys was 12.9 years, and for girls it was 11.7 years. Now, age analysis showed that females left home after the age of 19 and males left after the age of 25. More males stayed at home until they were 25 in Dublin City than in Dublin City overall, so more of them in North Wall. And this points to the availability of work and stable family homes. And non-dependent children also tended to stay at home to support widowed mothers. So when we look at North Wall and the North Wall community, or any community, we know that the age structure as shown in the pyramid and the types of household that exist are driven by fertility and mortality experiences in that community. So the second part of my research was to analyse mortality in North Wall. Now, in a mortality study, you typically consider the interactions between infant and child mortality, social class and environment. And looking at mortality in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, we know from studies that urban dwellers paid a mortality penalty where mortality was higher than in rural areas. So when we look at infant and child mortality, there are 3 key measures. The infant mortality rate, or the IMR, which is a measure of the death of infants under the age of 1 per 1,000 live births. The early childhood mortality rate, or ECMR, which is a measure of all deaths from the age of 1 to 4. and the child mortality rate, which is a measure of all deaths under the age of 5. And these rates are key indicators of the health of a nation. So let's look at the reported infant mortality rate. Now, this table is taken from the 1911 census report for the Dublin registration area. And using the data in the report, I was able to isolate the figures for Dublin City, highlighted here in blue. Now, you can see that child mortality was higher in Dublin than in other cities in Britain. And this is no surprise, with overcrowding in buildings that are unfit for habitation, poor sanitation, and the consequent effect of that on hygiene, as well as poverty leading to poor nutrition and, of course, the spread of disease. Now, reinforcing these circumstances, Dublin, as we know, was a transport-dominant port city, providing a migration corridor to Britain, but also transmission paths for epidemic diseases. Now, you can see from the table that IMR goes up and it goes down, but when Dublin City is isolated from the figures, you can see that the mortality rate is much higher. So we know that generally, and not just in Ireland, that IMR in urban settings saw little improvement, despite the focus on sanitation and improved scavenging. And scavenging is basically bin collections, getting the rubbish out of the city. One of the main causes of death amongst children was diarrhea and other gastric diseases causing malnutrition. But then this was common in other cities in the 19th century as well. Now, public health measures were implemented to address what was viewed as a social problem, alongside pressure on mothers to improve nutrition and hygiene in the home. But there was also a view that Catholicism was responsible for poor health and mortality, and this view was indeed held by the Special Sanitation Commissioner for the Lancet. Now, using the reports of the Registrar General, I compiled the infant mortality rate, the early child mortality rate, and the child mortality rate for Dublin North for the period 1887 to 1911. Now, this graph shows that IMR is not showing much of a decline. But the early childhood rate, or the ECMR, is declining at a faster rate. And when you combine the two rates together, you can see that the rate of decline is greater overall. Now, the spike, if I just draw your attention to two of the spikes, the spike in 1897 reflects measles, whooping cough, and inflammatory diseases of the respiratory system, which were particularly fatal early that year, when excess deaths occurred in children and young persons. Now, mortality in 1899 was high due to, and I quote the Registrar General here when he wrote, a severe epidemic of measles in the later months of the year, an exceptionally heavy mortality from diarrhea amongst children in the third quarter, and the increased prevalence of tuberculosis, influenza, and inflammatory diseases of the respiratory system. More than 2/3 of the whole excess occurred among children under 5 years of age. Now, from an environmental viewpoint, North Wall experienced considerable local hazards. Now, other studies have shown that the proximity to the Liffey is linked with an insignificant increase in mortality, but it was filthy. And the elevation of the area from 1 to 16 metres meant that North Wall was low-lying with a risk of flooding. And was already noted, the standard of housing was mainly third class and of poor quality. In 1919, a Dublin Corporation housing scheme inquiry was held to discuss the purchase of properties on Newfoundland Street for redevelopment. Now, the medical officer of health, Sir Charles Cameron, he gave evidence, and he said that the Newfoundland Street area was unsanitary, with old houses not fit for habitation, although he felt that this was not the worst slum area in Dublin City. Now, his assistant, Dr. Russell, considered the housing in the area to be, in his words, bad, with old, poorly maintained buildings that had poor ventilation and were damp with rotten floors. Now, other nuisances include atmospheric pollution with constant running of ships' steam engines. You had smoke from train engines and nearby factories. You also had the movement of pigs and cattle to lairage along Mare Street and the consequent manure soilage along the streets and in the lairage itself. Now, we've already seen the number of stables and cattle sheds in North Wall, as well as the piggeries, and these were an attraction to flies. In the summer of 1911, Dublin experienced a heat wave, as did North America, Britain, and Europe, which dramatically increased the number of flies to the extent that it was branded an invasion. and resulted in epidemic diarrhea amongst infants and children. But of course, seasonal diarrhea was a recurrent consequence of warm weather and was responsible for a considerable portion of infant death. So, excuse me, so what I wanted to do next was look at patterns of death. Now, by using census data on the number of children born and surviving, I was able to use indirect measurement techniques that were published by the United Nations to measure the probabilities of death, called a mortality index. And a mortality index compares the expected to observed mortality rates. Now, in this way, I could use additional census data to see, for example, if the education of the parents had any impact on child mortality, the same for cultural or religious differences, as well as using occupation and the standard of accommodation as proxies for poverty. So studies have shown that a mother's literacy was found to have a positive influence on mortality. And among the North Wall children whose mothers were literate, mortality was 98% of the North Wall average, compared to 114% for children of illiterate mothers. Children born to native Dublin mothers had 106% mortality compared to the North Wall average, while non-Dubliners were 88%. And where the father was born outside Ireland, mortality was 191% of the North Wall average. Sorry. Now, studies have also shown that religion was found to influence mortality, with non-Catholics faring better than Catholics. Among North Wall children whose mothers were non-Catholic, mortality was 37% of the North Wall average, compared to 102% for those born to Catholic mothers. Children born to labourers had 110% mortality, compared to non-labourers who were 86% of the average. Now, mortality amongst the children of sailors, stokers and firemen was 73% of the North Wall average, while carters was low at 36%. Now, there's no denying that tenement living provided an increased risk of dying, but the results of my analysis presented me with a conundrum, because third-class accommodation provided a lower risk of death. So when I inspected the data, I could see that women living in second-class housing in North Wall in 1911, who were married for more than 4 years, experienced higher child mortality than expected. And this points to other unknown factors at play. Now, the number of rooms also presented a similar conundrum, because you would expect that the more rooms occupied, the lower the mortality rate. Again, on inspection, these women were married for 10 to 14 years, who were living in more than 2 rooms, experienced higher child mortality than those living in 2 rooms or less. Now, in this instance, these mothers were married in 1896 to 1900, and as shown earlier, epidemic diseases were prevalent at this time, with the greatest impact on those under 5 years of age. Now, CAMPOP had conducted a study of residential mobility in Belfast, and they used the 1901 and 1911 census records. Now, they also found difficulties using housing and density as proxies for poverty. And the findings of that study show that higher child mortality was associated with those living in overcrowded conditions, where the head of the family was a labourer, and where the family moved home frequently, which is also a feature, of course, of Dublin City and North Wall. So their study suggests that poverty affected mortality directly rather than indirectly through housing. And this seems to be the case in North Wall as well. Now, the final part of my research was to investigate how fertility was manifest in the North Wall community. I wanted to find out if there was evidence of a fertility decline in North Wall, and did females control their fertility through spacing and stopping birth control techniques. Now, you may know that the 1911 census was known as the fertility census, certainly in Britain, as it included 3 additional questions on marriage duration, the number of children born, and the number of children alive. Now, these same questions were asked in the census of England and Wales, along with the number of children who had died. And in 1923, the Registrar General Stevenson issued his fertility report, but no similar report was issued for Ireland by the Registrar General Thompson. Now, analysis of fertility really got underway in 1963 when Princeton University launched the influential European Fertility Project, or EFP for short, and it aimed to study fertility decline in Europe. Now, its findings showed that birth control was not in broad use before the decline began, and once family planning was used and marital fertility began to decline, it was irreversible. Now, where is Ireland in all of this? Well, Ireland was seen as an outlier in the fertility transition that had swept across Europe in the late 19th century, with our reported high fertility rate. Now, the reason for this was attributed to low rates of urbanisation and industrialisation, as well as our culture with the domination of Catholicism. Now, the view that Ireland's fertility decline was significantly later than other European countries originated with the EFP. And they asserted that the fertility transition occurred here after the 1920s, but this has been subject to much revision in recent years. Now, a study by David and Sanderson found that fertility was starting to decline in urban areas in 1911. In his study, Cormac O'Grada found that fertility declined by about 10% between 1881 and 1911, with evidence of spacing. And he found that more than 1/5 of rural Irish women married in their 20s were controlling their fertility. Another detailed inter-country study found extensive limitation among older marrying couples back to the 1880s. Yet another study found that fertility was related to traditionalism in society and correlated this with the naming practices of parents by using the same names over and over throughout the generations. Now, there's no doubt that Catholics had higher fertility rates than other denominations, but by the First World War, a substantial minority were controlling their fertility and avoiding large families. As Professor John Fitzgerald notes, prior to 1970, the factors driving fertility can be decomposed into the proportion of women marrying, the age at which they married, and the average number of children born to a married woman each year. So the first task for me was to look at marriage in North Wall. Now, looking across the total sample, I found that most marriages were to those aged 20 to 24, representing 43.2% of the total. Marriage declined from the age of 25. There was a visible spike in marriage for those aged 35 to 39 at 12.3%, which possibly reflects second marriages, particularly for men, who accounted for 16.6%. Compared to 8.4% for women. Now, overall, those under the age of 20 accounted for 17.9% of the total number. And there was a high level of marriage amongst women marrying under 20 years of age compared to men in the same cohort. So then I decided to look at marital changes for women back in time to see what the percentage distribution was according to when the marriage occurred. And looking at the data this way allows us to track the impact of fertility by changes in the length of the overall fertility period. Now, married women aged more than 34 years were excluded from the analysis because of the increased risk that they married for a second time. And the results showed that the majority were married by 29 years of age. In 1882 to 86, 27.3% of women were aged 20 to 24 when they married, and 51.5% of women were under the age of 20. In 1907 to 11, 64% of women were aged 20 to 24 when they married, with 8% aged under 20. So this represents a substantive change in the age at marriage. And the minimum age of marriage for women rose from 15.9 years in 1877 to 81 to 18.7 years in 1907 to 11. So now we look at fertility. We'll start by positioning North Wall within Dublin North City number 1 East District, which is the Registrar's District within the North Dublin Union. And from here, I'll refer to it as DNC1E. Now, as you can see, DNC1E stretched from the Custom House here in the south, along the Liffey out to Alexander Basin in the east, up to Croke Park here at its northern point. Now, I've used the reports of the Registrar General to estimate the crude birth rate for DNC1E, which shows a slow decline in fertility, from 24.9 per thousand of the population in 1899 to 21.8 per thousand in 1911. Now, as reported in the 1911 annual report of the Registrar General, the crude birth rate for Dublin City was 31.2 per thousand, and I've calculated the North Wall rate to be 26 per thousand. So we know that fertility is in decline, that fertility in DNC1E is actually lower than that of the city overall, but North Wall had a higher fertility rate than DNC1E. So I also wanted to look at the pattern of fertility and see what the pattern was like. And the best way to see the pattern is by using graphs. Now, I used census data to calculate what are called age-specific marital fertility rates. And these rates measure the number of births to married women grouped by their age. Now, for the analysis, married women no older than 49 and with children under the age of 5 were selected. So this gives us a picture of fertility in the 5 years prior to the census. Now, from the graph, we can see here, if I just click on it here, that fertility peaked in the 25 to 29 age cohort and then rapidly declined. Now, I also looked at household type and literacy patterns, but the most interesting pattern was between the wives of labourers and non-labourers. So from a socio-economic perspective, we can see here that non-labourers had higher fertility rates in North Wall than North Wall overall, while labourers had a lower fertility. And this lower fertility is perhaps evidence of limited resources being available to sustain a family. Now, going back to the last question, is there evidence of spacing and stopping? Now, I analysed the sample as far back as 1880 to investigate the use of stopping and spacing birth control strategies, as this provides the greatest chance of identifying stopping behaviour, as well as insight into fertility control at a time further away from the census date. And for this part of the research, I used a micro-study approach to collate completed fertility histories of married women in the 45 to 49 age cohort. Now, families were reconstituted using a mix of census records, birth, marriage and death records, and burial records. And only those families with a complete reproductive history where that could be established were included in the analysis. And these reconstitutions proved problematic. Only 14 out of 33 families could be fully reconstituted. Now, this table shows the mean birthday in intervals. This table shows the mean birth intervals in days grouped by the time of marriage into 5-year cohorts. So on the left here on the vertical axis is the number of days between births, and across the bottom on the horizontal axis is what's known as parity progression, or progression from one birth to the next. So for those married between 1880 and 1884, spacing appears ad hoc in early marriage, but was certainly used as a control method at later parities. Now, the long interval between the 11th and the 12th birth suggests a failed attempt to stop and to limit family size. And this again happened at the 12th birth here. You can see it was from 12 to 13, so that's a long distance there. And then all of a sudden we have another child. Now, similarly, this is evident in the 85 to 89 marital cohort with a failed attempt at stopping at 8 births. But a reduction in family size is evident over time, with later marrying women using fertility to control to determine their family size. And then we can see the last one is it's fairly evenly spaced out in the 1900 to 1904 cohort. Now, using the same sample, we can see here that the age of marriage, as it increases, the fertile period decreases. Now, the fertile period is considered between the age of 15 and 49. So that equates to a complete cycle of 35 years. So the median age or the halfway point of that period is 32.5 years of age. So what's interesting here is the mean or average age at last birth for those married furthest away from the census. at 33 to 36 years. And this points to stopping being used to control fertility by North Wall women approximately halfway through the fertile period. Now, those married at a later age have a shorter fertile period available, but again, fertility is controlled within 6 to 8 years of marriage. So, in conclusion, the study showed that this was a hard-working community where economic pressures determined the survival of families. The choice of accommodation was determined by the level of poverty, but I feel too that some were taken advantage of by greedy landlords. Now, despite Sir Charles Cameron claiming that the area not to be the worst slum, the density of the community, coupled with poor housing, meant the inevitable easy spread of epidemic diseases, which took their toll on young children. But where parents were from, how educated they were, and their cultural background all played a part in determining the survival of their children at their most vulnerable stage in life. Now, for me, the evidence around fertility showed how couples, but particularly women, were determining when they were having children and for how long. Now, we don't know the precise methods that couples were using, but the evidence is there in North Wall that they knew how to space out births and took decisions to stop having any more children earlier than I would have expected. So I hope my study has given you an understanding of the demographics of North Wall and how the local environment influenced the community's lived experiences. I'd like to thank you very much for your time this evening, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.